Hello everybody and welcome to the table. So today we have a knife right here. This one I feel really bad. I actually have had this knife for quite a while now. This is the Lander 2, but I just never got around to making a video on it. So I'm going to share my thoughts about this knife and some information you may not be aware of if you were thinking about picking up either the Lander 1 or the Lander 2 here. So the Lander 2, the knife we have, this actually is coming to us from Knaf's. And so this knife is pretty much well known for being able to swap out the scales on the knife relatively easily. So the original Lander is a little bit smaller, so we can see these two knives side by side. And you can see I've already dressed up this Lander 1 with these donut-themed scales. So I think that's kind of nifty. But the fact that the Landers have quite the ecosystem of scales out there really gives you variety. So if you want to change your scales on a whim, these knives kind of let you do so. And so one of the really nice things about changing out the scales on these knives is that the design makes it quite easy. So for instance, on the Lander 1 right here, I can do it actually right on camera. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 screws to take off, and you can just unscrew those pretty easily off the knife. So once you take off those 4 screws, the scale just pops right off. So we can see this one, for instance, comes from Chroma Scales. It just goes right onto the design, and you can swap them out like they're Legos. So 4 screws and you're done. And so that's really kind of the revolutionary thing. So if you own a Lander 1, being that this is the more established of the two knives here, there is quite the ecosystem of scales out there, whether you like titanium, micarta, G10, whatever material, whatever color, whatever design, there's a lot of options for you out there. So much so that we even have donut handles. But I really do like that design motif and that idea. So this is why I backed this original knife on Kickstarter. And it's also why I backed the Lander 2 on Kickstarter as well. So what that basically did is that they upsized the knife so we can see again side by side. We have a larger blade, we have higher end materials. We also now have a crossbar lock as opposed to a liner lock on the original Lander there. And so in upgrading these materials, what really changed with the design? And there's one striking thing I'm going to mention in just a minute, but first off, the knife itself. So the Lander 2, really beautiful blade, and having carried it for a while now, because of course the Kickstarter was awarded quite a while ago, and again, like I said, I apologize, I just never got a chance to make a video on this particular knife, so we're taking a look at it now. We do have an S35 VN blade right there with a nice drop point, about a 3.5-inch blade. So pretty much a good size in hand everyday carry knife. And so one of the knives that I notably compare it to in terms of size is actually going to be another blue axis lock style knife. So this is the Benchmade Bug Out right there. So we can see again side by side they are very, very, very similar in overall size. Now the Lander is going to be probably a little bit heavier in terms of weight, so we can run that by real quick and check that out. So the Bug Out's going to come in 1.94 ounces, so less than 2 ounces, while our Lander 2 with its steel liners is going to come in 2.8 ounces, so a little bit heavier, about an ounce more in weight. But in terms of overall size, if you own a Bug Out, know that this is going to be very comparable in hand to what the Lander 2 is featuring here. But again, in hand feels great. The action is really impeccable. This is on the crossbar lock, the axis lock with bearings, so that blade, as you can see, it just swings quite freely. Feels really good in hand. The pocket clip, again, we have another deep carry clip, just like the original Lander right here. And what really changed with this design, again, the slight upsizing, and as we see this Lander 2 become more mainstream, I'm hoping the ecosystem of scales becomes quite as popular as the Lander 1. But one thing I noticed, and I wanted to share it with everybody on camera, is there is one distinct change that happened between these two knives here. Of course, liner lock, crossbar lock, but I believe they also changed manufacturers as well. So I'm not going to drop names because I'm not that knowledgeable on the subject. But what we have here, let's go ahead and take off this scale, and we're going to see the big difference. So we got to take off the little plate right there. There we go. So once that plate's gone, we have one screw right there. And this is what tripped me up on the knife initially as well. So we take that off, and I was just trying to pull the knife apart, but then I realized one change is the pivot. So on the original Lander here, we do not have to remove the pivot to change out the scales, which I think is an excellent part of the design because I really don't want to have to mess with the pivot action if I don't have to. But on the Lander 2, I suppose with the crossbar lock, something changed with the manufacturer, something changed. So now we actually do have to take out the pivot screw, and then the scale pops right off. So the only downside to that is when you mess with the pivot screw, sometimes the action can get messed up. If you're not super careful, things can come apart a lot easier. And I don't know if you can see it on camera right there, but there's sometimes going to be some Loctite in that pivot, which can make it quite difficult to actually remove the pivot at times. So that's kind of a downside in my opinion. Really the only downside in terms of this knife overall. What's really cool though about it, while we have the knife open right here, we can see the little the axis lock spring bar right there. I forget what they call it, the coil spring. No, not a coil spring. I forget what the name of the spring is, but you can see that there are 5 different holes right there on the frame where you can place that spring. So if you wanted to make your lock looser, you can do that. If you wanted to make it tighter, you can do that as well. So the adjustability on the knife is still there. So I think that's pretty cool. Again, the only downside for me, I'm not really a fan of taking out the actual pivot screw to break down the knife. So if that's something that's going to be a deal breaker for you, I just wanted you to be aware of that now, because it's something that's not immediately noticeable until you do try and swap out scales. And so due to the newness of the Lander 2 here, so due to the newness of the knife, I don't have any replacement scales for it yet, but I'm certainly going to pick some up once I'm able to. So that's something I'm keeping an eye out for. So that is definitely something I'm going to be interested in checking out. But I love the overall design. Now, Knaf's is kind of the brainchild of Ben Peterson. He used to work over at Blade HQ, and now he does all of his own awesome knife stuff through Knaf's. And so I own quite a few of their products, and everything there is pretty darn solid. So the fact that we can change out the scales pretty quickly is always a plus, and I will tell you why. For instance, recently, what we have on the table right here, let's take a look at the Spyderco Paramilitary 2. And so I swapped out the scales on this knife. I'll just put it down side by side for comparison. But I had original scales right here. So these are those bluish purple G10 scales on this. This is an S110V Spyderco PM2. And so changing out the scales on the PM2 involved quite a bit more work than just unscrewing a few screws and swapping things out. You literally have to take the knife apart to the bones, so to speak, and then swap things out and reassemble and hope everything fits, hope nothing's Loctited, hope nothing strips out. And so I was pretty lucky in that I have the tools necessary to take this thing apart, but it was not a fun process like it should have been. Whereas with the Lander, absolutely a joy to take these apart and to mess around with them, disassemble them. And like this one right here, again, just the way that these things can be machined to fit right on top of the original scales is just awesome. So I really do appreciate that when it comes to the actual Lander design. And I love this original Lander design with just the 2 screws and then the pocket clip holder right there. It just makes everything super simple. So it makes the whole knife collecting and playing around with thing even nicer. And now, of course, in terms of action, both of these knives are quite incredible. Liner lock, crossbar lock, even the liner lock though, look at that drop action. Very nicely done, very well made knife overall. If you prefer the smaller knives, the Lander 1 is going to do you just fine. If you prefer a larger blade, Lander 2 should do fine as well. Both of them carry beautifully with the deep carry pocket clips, smooth scales. So absolutely no issues there, no problems there. I just wanted to share my experience again. The big thing being with the Lander 2, you do have to remove that pivot in order to swap out scales. So if that's something that you don't want to have to do, just keep that in mind when you make your purchases. But that being said, if the Lander 1 is more your style, there's a whole world of scales out there for this knife that look awesome. And the knife is a little bit smaller, but that's really the only difference between these two. I assume they were different OEMs that made the knives, but quality-wise, side by side, they are certainly brother and sister. So hope you enjoyed watching. If you have any comments about these knives, feel free to drop those below. But I hope you all have a nice day, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.